Hello, ladies and gentlemen, and everything in between. Welcome back to GEEXX Reads. Today I want to talk about a Stephen King novel called The Stand, an image of which you will see here. Stand is a post-apocalyptic fantasy novel. Because the novel was written a few decades ago, this post-apocalyptic stuff takes place in the 80s or 90s, according to the story. But a brief outline with some minor spoilers. Story starts off with a single chapter in Texas where like a car crashes into like a gas station where a bunch of people, a bunch of locals are hanging around. They're like inside the gas station hanging out talking. Car crashes outside. They go outside. There's a family in there, a father, wife, and small child, who all are massively sick. Basically, behind the scenes, at some research facility, a man-made plague had been accidentally let loose. This man got out before they locked the doors and basically spread the plague across the country before he died. The story bounces around introducing the other characters. This book has a large cast of characters. It bounces around from Texas to Maine to New York to Las Vegas. As you're introduced to new various characters in the story, all basically the introductions happen mostly before the plague happens. A few of them during, some after. And of course, you have a couple teenagers from southern Maine who survive the plague. The plague itself kills like over 99% of the population. Only about 0.6% of the population is naturally immune. And then other people die as the result of the collapse of civilization. The remaining human population on the planet is very, very small. So one of the characters who is immune is a guy named Stu Redman from the gas station where it crashed. When it's discovered he's immune, the government locks him up trying to find out why he's immune, trying to create some kind of vaccine or cure from his blood. When they fail, he escapes. He is eventually met by Harold and Franny, who are the survivors from Maine. There's like a one-hit wonder pop singer who survives, a school teacher from New Hampshire, one guy who's convicted of armed robbery where people are killed. He's in jail waiting to be executed. One of the characters who introduces a guy named Randolph Flagg, the Dark Man, the walking dude. He is not necessarily the devil, but he is an embodiment of evil. He doesn't necessarily even know who he is, just that bad things happen when he's around, and he rather enjoys that. He basically believes that this plague is the sign that he's basically destined to rule the earth and take control. Another character is a guy called Trash Can Man. He's a mentally unstable pyromaniac. Another character, his name is Tom Cullen. I like Tom Cullen. Tom Cullen is basically a simple-minded person who, in the initial story, is in his 30s or 40s, but he has the mind of like a 5-year-old. He has a constant reference of he spells everything M-O-O-N, moon, regardless of what the word is. M-O-O-N, that spells Nebraska. So that's a recurring theme with this character. He talks in a very simple, childlike manner. I like Tom Cullen. He's fun. There's a character named Nick Andros who is deaf and mute, who actually is the first person Tom Cullen's the first person Nick Andros meets. So he can't talk or hear, and Tom can only spell moon and can't read. So that is a somewhat, for a dark book like this, that's somewhat of an amusing introduction. But the characters, both good and bad. I want to talk about Lloyd, the guy who is sentenced to prison. He is rescued from prison by Randolph Flagg. Randall Flagg is somehow drawn to him and finds him in prison and opens the doors, because otherwise he was going to starve to death. And he gives Lloyd a magic stone, which, when looked at one way, looks like a stone with like a red center, and if you turn it another way, it looks like a key. And it's used to open the lock of the door of his cell. And Lloyd is one of Flagg's most loyal supporters. That's kind of important. But people begin to have dreams. Some of them dream an old woman, Mother Abigail, who lives in the Nebraska cornfields. Some people dream of Randolph Flagg. And depending on the nature of these dreams, they are either drawn to Mother Abigail in Nebraska, or they are drawn to Randolph Flagg in Las Vegas. The book is essentially a standoff between good and evil. Mother Abigail has prophetic visions from God that tells her what to do, and she knows she knows people are coming to her. She knows people are having dreams about her. She eventually leads them to actually Boulder, Colorado, to create like a new civilization, not civilization necessarily, but a community. And Flagg sets up a community in Las Vegas. Flagg knows about Boulder, Colorado. He does eventually plan to eradicate it. The people in Colorado are also aware of Flagg through their own dreams and their prophecies. Flagg frightens them in their dreams. Basically, good people are frightened by Flagg, and bad people are drawn to him. So people like Trash Can Man go to Flagg. There are people in the Boulder community who secretly do join Flagg later, although the people in Boulder do at some point send spies to see what Flagg is up to. The final confrontation at the end is when Mother Abigail leaves the community because she feels she has sinned. The sin of pride, of being too proud of the people who have come to Boulder. She's too proud of her position, so she thinks she has sinned against God. She leaves the community. And when she comes back on the verge of death, she's 108 years old anyway at the start of the story, tells them that some people have to go to confront Flagg, which they do. Flagg is eventually defeated. I won't tell you exactly how, because I've explained a lot of the story anyway. And the story has like a brief epilogue of what happens to, the people who remain in Boulder. Some of the people who remain in Boulder, Colorado, at least the ones that we're familiar with. That's the overall breakdown of the story without giving away too many specific details. And that's more of a more spoilers than I usually give, although I felt it was important. This book is this is one of the thickest books I read as a kid. This is actually one of the earlier releases of the book. Stephen King actually cut like 400 pages out of the book. The unabridged edition actually makes it one of the longest Stephen King book ever written. The second one being It. This is a few pages longer than It. Stephen King, when he wrote this book, a couple things inspired him to write the book. He wanted to write like a big epic, like The Lord of the Rings, but have it set in America. He was also inspired by the Patty Hearst trials, which is very complicated, but no one's ever, she somehow was either abducted by this terrorist organization or she voluntarily joined. She was put on trial, sentenced to prison, because people, but there's a whole thing about that. And he was also inspired. There was a spill from the, like a government research lab in Utah. And the only thing that happened was a few sheep died, but if the wind had gone the other way, it would have blown all this stuff into Salt Lake City, Utah. And King just remembers horrified watching images of what happened to mice who were exposed to whatever this was that was a spill. They were dead in 20 seconds. They just, convulsed and died in 20 seconds. And it horrified him. And his initial thought, he was having writer's block, was having a hard time putting the story together. And he just wrote a sentence that this terrorist organization was the only surviving members of this massive plague for some bizarre reason, and it's like, well, at least there's no more gas shortage. And he just kind of was like, little things like that. This is not only my favorite Stephen King book, but one of my favorite books of all time. This is definitely my top 10 books, and possibly even my top 5. This book is complicated, though. There's a large cast of characters. And I think that is actually what makes it work well, surprisingly. I'm not what you would call a huge Stephen King fan. I don't read everything he puts out. I've probably read maybe a third of his books because I have some problems with Stephen King's writing style. His Act 1 is always amazing. Act 2 is usually pretty good too. But for me, his books tend to fall apart somewhere between late Act 2, early Act 3. Not necessarily fall apart, I think. They bog down. Stephen King is very wordy. I was reading a book, I think The Tommyknockers, and I was reading and reading and reading. I love the book, but then it just like, there's so much going on that has no relevance. It's just pages and pages and pages of stuff that's happening, but it doesn't move the story forward. It's just stuff that he's talking about. And I kind of skipped like 5 or 6 chapters and started reading, and it didn't feel like I'd missed anything. No new information had come out. There was no progression, no character development, no story development. Stuff just continued to happen, and he kept writing it. And that's been one of my main problems with a lot of Stephen King books, is that, he just gets overly wordy. He needs to trim his books down a little bit. And I personally think the abridged version is better than the full release, because like, I think the full unabridged edition gives too much information that you don't really need. It details exactly how the plague was released. It tells you about the security guard who, it talks about the viruses. Someone opens the wrong vial, the virus is released, and he skirts out. As the alarms are going off, he slips out of the building before the gates lock down, because they attempt to lock it down and contain it. There's supposed to be a quarantine where no one's allowed to leave if this kind of thing happens, and he panics and leaves. And it details the whole thing, and it's like, you don't need that. It doesn't need, it's an explanation that doesn't need to happen. I think the story works better without it. There are other things, the ending of the book, as it is right now, I think works fine, but in the unabridged edition, they expand on the ending. It's like, doesn't need to happen. So I prefer this to the full 1,200-page version. Other than a few complaints, another problem I have with Stephen King's writing is that he, I think the endings of his books don't always land well with me. For some reason, I don't know why. And even this one, it feels a bit too Deus Ex Machina. Just, things happen because the divine hand of God said it had to happen, kind of thing. That's, all the bad stuff that happened because it was prophesized to happen. It was gonna happen because God wills it so. I think it robs the characters a lot of agency. And I think it creates kind of an abrupt, stuttered ending, in my opinion. But even then, I do think this is one of the better Stephen King endings. I think it's handled really well, except for like a couple of moments. And like I said, because because this book has so many characters, he doesn't have the opportunity to bog the stuff down in details. He has to keep it, at least in the unabridged edition, he has to keep it a bit more concise. He can't waste time. There's too much going on. The book is told from several people's perspectives, and it does bounce back and forth between, Randolph Flagg, Trash Can Man, Lloyd, and the other characters that are centered on Flagg, and Francine and Harold and, Nick Andros and Tom Cullen and Stu and all the other characters that are surrounding, are drawn to Mother Abigail. I think of the good people Stu and Franny are the two most common points of view, if I remember correctly. But you do get the other characters too. Like the point of view bounces back and forth, and he does it. He does that transition extremely well. You know, and it is a hard thing to do for a writer. You know, I've read other books where the point of view bounces back and forth, and it is jarring and hard to get used to, and it doesn't flow well. I think this flows really, really well. You know, he really, you know, when you close off a chapter from one character, start a new one, it closes off well and doesn't leave you, well, it might leave you hanging, but it doesn't leave, you don't feel like that it's unfinished. You might want more of the story, but you don't feel, you know, there's no really jarring changes from points of view. If you have not read Stephen King The Stand, and if I haven't spoiled it too much for you, there are a few books in my collection that I would recommend more than this book. It is hands down one of my top books of all time. I have read this book well over a dozen times. It's actually held up pretty well. I think this book is like got a plastic coating. I don't know if you can see how shiny it is. It's got someone, well, to be honest, not someone. I borrowed this book from my high school library and never brought it back. I didn't do it intentionally. But you get one of those things like, do I bring it back now? I just kind of took it home and then forgot to bring it back. So it does have, you know, it's in better condition than a lot of the other books I have that I've read this often. But that's because the library put a plastic sealant on the cover to keep it in good shape. So I'm a bad boy. I did not return a library book. As always, thanks for watching. As always, my stuff is crap. And until next time, good hunting.